So, whoops, what happened there? Alright, so you see on the map, this is a map of Paul's missionary journeys. And one of the main focuses of this chapter is Paul's outreach to the Gentiles. But here, here you have Jerusalem, and this is where the church starts. That's where Jesus is crucified. And even though Jesus was from up here in northern Israel, where Galilee is at, because the disciples had all gathered in Jerusalem when he was crucified, they're still gathered there afterward. And so Jerusalem's sort of like the home base for the church. And then if you look up here, some other important places that we're going to see, Antioch is an important center of Christianity. It's the first place where Christians are called Christians, and they were called the Way in Jerusalem. But Antioch is sort of the home of the church is Jerusalem. Antioch's like the springboard for missionary efforts. When Paul and Barnabas start to go off and do their missionary work, they start in Antioch usually and go out from there. And as you can see from these little lines on the map, they often return to Jerusalem to check in with like the mother church at home in Jerusalem. And all these other little places, these are going to be places where Paul will minister and start churches. So, for example, you see Ephesus, that's an important Christian city. You see, you have, I'm trying to find some of the places where Paul started churches. I can't read this, though. I see Ephesus. He wrote to the Ephesians. He also had some churches here in this Lystra area. There's places like Galatians and places like that where he starts churches. There's Galatia. So he wrote a letter to the Galatians. This city here, Tarsus, that's where Paul had lived before he became a missionary, and he was a tent maker there in Tarsus. Also, I don't see, we have Antioch, so yeah, I think that's good for the geography. So that's sort of the geography that we're going to be seeing. And you see how far Paul spread Christianity. It starts as this tiny Jewish sect in Jerusalem, and Paul is going to spread it all the way to Italy. And Paul will eventually make it to Rome, as will Peter, where both of them end up dying as martyrs. So you're going to have quite a few characters you're going to meet in the documentary, and you're going to see two different ideas about what Christianity should be like. So, first of all, in Jerusalem, at the Jerusalem church, this is like, this is sort of like the mother church. It all starts in Jerusalem at Pentecost, and the church is born in Jerusalem, but it's going to spread out to other areas. And one of the first areas it will spread to is Antioch, up there in like southern Turkey area. So in the Jerusalem church, you have the apostles, and you have the leader in the Jerusalem church is James, the brother of Jesus. So James is the leader there, and although he's not called a bishop, he basically plays the role of the bishop of that church. He runs the day-to-day operations. He makes the decisions. Another person who was really important in the Jerusalem church was John. And so in Jerusalem, James sort of runs everything. And so that might make you wonder, well, what about Peter? Wasn't he the first pope? Peter is definitely in a leadership role that as the pope. He baptizes Christians right there on Pentecost Day. He'll be the first one to baptize Gentiles. He had a vision from Jesus, and he baptized Cornelius, the first Gentile to be baptized. But Peter isn't tied down to the church. James stays in Jerusalem and sort of runs everything from there, whereas we see Peter going to Antioch. Like I said, he eventually ends up in Rome where he dies. So Peter really does act, even in this early time of the church where we didn't have all the roles we have now, like priests and bishops and deacons. Those roles are just starting to be defined. But Peter definitely plays this leadership role where he is above the church and kind of over everything, and that he has the freedom of movement, whereas James stays in Jerusalem and kind of runs things from there. Now, in the Jerusalem church, you had some groups that, this is the phase we call Jewish Christianity, but you had some groups that basically, the more Jewish of the groups within the, and you find these people, especially in Jerusalem, within the church, they thought that in order to be a Christian, you had to become Jewish first, because Jesus is Jewish. And they still thought of themselves as Jews. So what that basically meant is you have to get circumcised, and that's kind of messy, but you have to follow the food laws and participate in the festivals. So there were a lot of Christians in the Jewish church, in the Jerusalem church, that wanted people to still follow all these important Jewish laws. So you had to get circumcised, you had to follow the food purity laws, and they wanted people to honor the old Jewish festivals. Then you had other people, and they were sometimes identified as the Hellenic Christians, but they wanted the church to be open to Gentiles. We saw that St. Stephen is often associated with this group, and he ends up getting stoned to death in Jerusalem. So they wanted the church to be open to Gentiles. They wanted to do missionary work. Paul was among this group. He's going to be a convert from Judaism. And they said, you know what, no. They had a kind of 2 points. First of all, it was theological. Paul will argue, you do not have to be circumcised to be a Christian because Christ frees us from the law. He says circumcision does not save you. What saves you is the blood of Christ. The salvation is already won. All you have to do is have faith in Jesus to be saved. So Paul was, and he said, if you want to get circumcised, go ahead. But he didn't want people telling new converts that they had to be circumcised. But there's also a practical consideration. If Paul is going to go into the Gentile world and win converts, just from practical purposes, if he walks into a town and says, hey, all you adult men, come get saved, but you're going to have to get circumcised, and you can't have bacon cheeseburgers or pulled pork sandwiches anymore, it's not going to have a big appeal. So there was just, from a practical standpoint, if you're trying to get adult men to be circumcised in an age where there's no anesthesia and no antibiotics, you're not going to win a lot of converts. But for Paul, there's also that big theological concern as well. So Paul, let's just do a quick little bit of overview on Paul. Paul was a Pharisee, and he was educated under a famous rabbi named Gamaliel. So he has both a Jewish, but he also has a Greek education. When we read his letters, he has a very good command of Greek. He uses a lot of Greek rhetoric, so he may even know philosophy. And another thing about Paul, sometimes you hear him also called Saul. Saul is his Jewish name, and Paul is his Roman name. Paul he was a Roman citizen. So this makes Paul very interesting and very unique. He is sort of like the perfect Christian missionary because he was a Jew. As a matter of fact, you're going to hear in the documentary that Luke, who wrote Acts of the Apostles, says that he was at the stoning of St. Stephen. So we hear about Paul in Acts and in his letters. So Paul is the only person who we actually have direct writings of what the early Christian church was about. It's from Paul. We have his letters that were written before anything else in the Bible was. He starts writing his letters in the early 50s. So he's a really interesting character. And so, as I was saying, he's a Roman citizen, and he uses this to his advantage. When he'll go into a town, he'll first go to the synagogue, and he'll be like, hi, I'm Saul, I'm a Jew, let me tell you about Jesus. And then when the Jews don't want to listen to him, he'll go to the temples or the square where all the Gentiles are, and he'll say, hi, my name is Paul, I'm a Roman citizen, let me tell you about Jesus. So he sort of uses his sort of dual citizenship. He has a foot both in the world of Judaism and the world of the Gentiles, and he uses that into his advantage as a missionary. I had a teacher in grad school who hated Paul. He thought Paul was a con artist and a shyster. I don't think that at all. I think Paul's smart and knows what he's doing. But Paul does get into a lot of trouble. He's never fazed by it. What he basically does is he will go out, starting in Antioch with Barnabas, and Paul had sort of a pattern to his missionary work. He would go to big cities. Paul's a city guy, Peter's a country guy. And Paul will go to the big cities. He'll first go to the synagogue, tell the Jews about Jesus. If that doesn't work out, he'll go tell the Gentiles about Jesus. He'll get a church going there. And in the early church, there was called a house church because they were started in people's homes. A lot of times by women. We see a lot of women leading the churches in the early church. So he'll start a church, and then once it gets established, he gets some good people who can lead it. He'll leave and go start another church. And he'll keep going and going and going. And what would happen is the churches would come up with problems, so he would write them back, and that's where we get his letters from. And one of the letters that tells us the most about Paul's biography and who he was is Galatians. Galatians is a really interesting letter. If you're going to only read one Pauline epistle, it's probably not like the greatest theology, but it's got a lot of drama in it because Paul had converted the Galatians, and he started a church there, and apparently some missionaries went there and were telling everybody they had to be circumcised. And Paul gets really mad about this. And he gets mad. He calls the Galatians stupid. Then he says, okay, if you guys are going to circumcise yourselves, fine. I hope the knife slips when you do it. Yeah, he straight up says it. He says, I hope you castrate yourself. He was so mad at them. And there's so much passion in Paul's letters. Paul is he's an all-in type of guy. When he's a Jew, he's going to be the best Jew. When he's a Christian, he's going to be the best Christian. And he is just so passionate about what he does. He's a really interesting character. I mean, if you know how sometimes you get asked if there's anybody in history you can meet. If there was anybody in history I could meet, it would be Paul. He was just an amazing figure. And he and Peter, are the two pillars of the church. Peter was the first pope, but Paul was the one who really spread Christianity to the Gentiles. But that was with Peter's blessing. It was Peter who converted the first Gentile, and Gentile just means non-Jews. So, these two men are the pillars of our church, and that's who we're going to be studying about in chapter 3. And then your videos are going to tell the story in hopefully a more interesting way than the documentary. So that's just a little bit of background. It should help you as you're watching the documentary to kind of know what's going on. If any of you are absent for anything, it's on PBS website, and I put the links on Moodle. So if you miss it in class, it's no biggie. You can just watch it at home. So let's stop this here.